this is one of the busiest CEOs in the country, I am sure. This is Kirstin Beardsley, CEO from Food Banks Canada. Now, Kirstin, you and I talked in August, about 6, 7 months ago. We were just you kind of coming out of COVID, and we see the challenges, and we're trying to respond and do it the best we can as food banks across the country. And now that whole world seems to have changed again. So I thought it would be really great to talk to you, because you, more than me or anybody else, would have your real finger on the pulse of what's happening with food banks across the country. We know that provinces have their own food bank associations, some regions even do. But I think to hear from across the country, because this is definitely happening completely across the country, I thought it would be good to come to you. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We need an honest update as to what you see happening across the country, where some of the places are doing okay, maybe others that aren't, those kind of things. Can you just give us a quick kind of baptism into what you see about food banking in Canada now in this part of 2023?
Yeah, sure. So I probably said something along the lines in August of, it's the toughest summer in food banking that we've seen. And I think times got even tougher. So what we saw throughout the fall and into the winter is the cost of living crisis continues. So folks at, the lowest income levels and then moving up into middle classes are struggling to afford to pay for the basics. And that's having an impact on food banks. And that is truly everywhere. So some provinces fared a bit better during the pandemic, some regions, especially as we saw some of the income supports come in. But every food bank that we've talked to seems to be trending upwards. So whether they were, still dipping a bit lower than pre-pandemic or not, they're up and up in double digits usually. So a big amount of growth in a very short span of time. And it really feels what I'm most concerned about are a couple of things. One is people are exhausted. My sense from the food bankers is, that COVID was hard. It was about adapting constantly, about changing operating models and figuring out how we're going to serve communities in this vast unknown. And this almost feels worse or harder because the amount of people coming, but it doesn't feel to a lot of folks like there's anyone listening on the other end. So whether that's governments or communities are being stretched. And so they're not feeling as supported, and it feels a bit harder from my perspective. So that's one thing I'm really worried about, is that we can't let folks feel they're alone. And in my position, that means making sure there's support available. And then the other thing is, and it's a good reminder for all of us across the country, that the Arctic is part of our country, and that they're experiencing levels of food insecurity that are far beyond what we experience in the South. And it's like everything that we feel or experience here is exacerbated. And so I really am concerned with the depth of need up there, and like you mentioned, the provincial associations and regional associations, there's very little structure to the connections between food banking in the North. So that's a priority for us at Food Banks Canada.
Just this morning, we had the food banks from Southwest Ontario all come together here in London. We had a meeting, and we met with folks from Feed Ontario, which is the Ontario network of food banks. And they brought that very fact up, that the communities in Northern Ontario, I mean, they get maybe a third of what we get, right? They don't have nearly the fundraising or food raising kind of capacities that we do. Also, for some of them, I remember when I used to work in Ottawa, many of them got their food by mail.
Yeah.
It was delivered by Canada Postal Service that went there because they were isolated communities. There was no other way to get in. So I think you're really right. And yet when you hear about food banks and what's going on in the country, you don't hear too much about that. Right. And obviously it's much more dire there than it is here. So are you developing plans? And I'm sure you are. We've talked about this before, but plans for the northern regions. I know you came in as CEO with that's one of the things you really wanted to do. What kind of things are you working on there?
So we have, it is a priority for Food Banks Canada right now. We have a new Northern Program Officer. He's not new now, actually. He's been around probably over a year now. And it's really about building the relationships first. So understanding that, a lot of the communities, it's mostly Indigenous communities in the north that are experiencing food insecurity. So being mindful about the relationship and building trust first before we try to support in any way. So that's been his work, Jay Stevens. He's traveled to some communities in the Arctic and in Northern Ontario, Northern Manitoba, to get to know folks and bring food and start having those conversations around, what's the long term. We've also convened recently our first Northern Advisory Group. So starting to build a bit of structure so that people have relationships with others. I mean, when the North is not as connected as the South, you think of Nunavut, there aren't roads. And so people don't necessarily can't just, drive down the road and visit how the food bank in the next community over is doing their operations. So it's been a bit magical to see that come together. So again, it's about trust building and building those relationships first, but we're starting to see that there's a lot of connection happening and a lot of sharing of ideas, and being able to reach out to each other is just part of the work there. So it'll be we'll use the principle change moves at the speed of trust, and we'll just keep showing up and keeping our word and building those relationships. But it's like you said, when you are in a community where the majority of the people, the majority of the households experience food insecurity, which is the case in many of the far northern communities, your ability to sustain a food bank, to fundraise, to find food in that community, to support your operations, it's a completely different type of food banking than we see across southern Canada. So just even getting folks aware of that is part of the challenge.
And it's sometimes such an interesting cultural learning experience as well. We as a food bank here in London, for instance, we support a place called Sandy Lake, which is in Northern Ontario. And they have the highest type 2 diabetes rate in the world. It's a small community, but per capita that is just huge. So what we did is we put out money for fish nets, beaver traps, all of those kind of things, traditional farming supplies that they could food gathering kind of supplies. And then we went up there and we started to integrate that with them. And they were used to, getting things in stores and things like that, whatever was available. So for them to be able to try to return to the land, to return to fishing and other things was a bit of a challenge, not for the older ones, but for the younger generation who weren't used to doing that. And I remember jumping off the side of the boat in this cold lake, and there were these nets, fish nets underneath, and we were trying to fix them. And it's for sturgeon fish. And these sturgeon are like 10 feet long. Right. And I had no idea what I was doing. I felt like I was in the movie Jaws or something. All these huge fish started coming around. And what they were doing is that they were gathering them as they used to do so much in the past. And I think that's a big part of the responsibility for all of us as food banks is we don't want to come along and say, here's a London solution for you. We want to hear from their communities as well as what's necessary for their own heritage, how they keep food, preserve it, those kind of things. And I'm sure you're sensitive to that as well. You're not just trying to take a bunch of stuff from a grocery store and hand it up there. You're trying to help them with those areas, correct?
Exactly. And that's a great story and a great reminder. So I mentioned bringing food, but that's at the invitation of the communities. And so just being really mindful and listening to what the communities need at this moment. And exactly, a lot of what the communities are asking for is support to help with traditional hunting, trapping, gathering type of activities, and us being a conduit to support that. And it was great. Some of the funds we received during COVID allowed us to grant things that would not look in any way like traditional food banking. So funding, funding the salaries of hunters, because it's quite an expensive endeavor to get your snowmobile and your gun and your bullets and and the gas for your snowmobile. And so just having funding that's available to support that has been, that was one type of grant. There was another grant that was it's interesting. It's an Indigenous community looking at, and this is where sort of food security and climate change. So the caribou herd was crossing over, a migration path, but because it wasn't freezing over, the ice wasn't freezing over, the herd wasn't coming back. And so it wasn't a source of food for that community. So just building a fence to keep the herd and manage the migration path. So again, these are community-driven ideas that we're able to support. So you're right, we're very mindful of not coming in with preconceived ideas or plans, and just making sure we're being respectful and thoughtful about how we support communities. And sometimes that is sort of, we're doing, the community's got some plans around traditional food and food sovereignty, but right now we actually do need some emergency food in the community. And how can you support that? But it has to be at the request of the community.
Trying to build a sustainability into that model, right? So you're quite right. I'm really glad you're doing that. Can I tell you what is really hard for me as a food banker who's been around for 36 years? We're talking about how people are burned out. We were talking about it today with the other food banks. I think part of it was COVID was exhausting. Yeah. It was also exhilarating. Yeah. If I can be honest, I saw people come alive and show attention to things like hunger and homelessness like I hadn't seen previous to that. But then after you come out of it, you think, okay, now we're going to try to, and it just didn't work out that way, right? And I think probably the thing that I have found the hardest and has burned me out the most is to continue to go to the people that and the companies and the associations and the faith groups and others that have been so faithful to you over decades, and yet you're reaching crisis proportions. We set new records every week now at the London Food Bank, more than we've ever done in the past. And yet to go to people who themselves are having trouble affording rent, having trouble, food, all that, like it's just so hard. And I find it personally difficult to keep coming back to people like that who have given so much and have done so much for our food bank here in this city. I find that difficult. On the other hand, at Christmas time, we let the people know that they didn't have to donate to the food bank if they didn't want to, if they couldn't, because it was tough. Now, I said that on CBC. Now, that caused a few ruffled feathers when I did it, but I was really feeling this thing, that people were really feeling the crunch. And, and then Christmas was over and people gave half again more than they had the December before. So I think it does say something about, we need to respect that kind of generosity, right? Like I know food banks, we keep talking about they're supposed to be temporary and things like that. And I do think our donors understand that as well and would hope for the same thing. But that level of generosity, especially after COVID, that people could still step up to that level, that's really still what's keeping food banks going. It's that. I mean, people are finding times harder, but they still have this compassion gene built into them that continues to help. I'm sure you're seeing that across the country too, not just the challenges, but the generosity has largely maintained itself. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. And I have to say, it's one of the things that keeps me going is I do think there's a particular type of human response when you start to feel, and I think this is what happened in COVID as well. People saw empty shelves, and what was sort of inspiring was that resonated in them to give to food banks, because the closer you get to a feeling of food insecurity, it feels like people get even more generous, even though they're feeling stretched. And I feel you. I do think it's hard to go to the same folks over and over and say, I know we said it was a crisis last time, this time it's a real crisis. And one of the things I've been noodling is how food banking essentially is always in crisis. It's never okay. And yet, how do you then continue to raise the alarm? And it's a challenging one to continue to capture the public's attention. But I think food banks in local communities across this country are doing that, and the people are stepping up. I think what is frustrating to many of us is it doesn't feel like that's being matched from a policy level. It doesn't feel like governments are then stepping in to do what they need to do. Communities are, businesses are. Where's the policy that's going to stop this? And I think it's such an odd set of circumstances. It's an odd time. That even governments, it feels like they're sort of holding their breath and seeing, do we skate through this recession quickly if it comes, and just hope it doesn't last and we all sort of recover? Is it going to be quick, or is it going to be this long-term thing? And I'm feeling like even they don't know necessarily what we're looking at. And so the policies aren't following because they don't know what solution they're responding to. But it is I'm sure you're feeling this as well. I'm sure others are. It's an incredibly frustrating thing when your communities are stepping up, but it doesn't feel like that's resonating with the politicians who need to put the policies in place.
Yeah, and it doesn't follow a partisan kind of formula. I mean, all governments are cutting back on that. And I think it is hard because I've been in government. Yeah. So, and I see what it's like, but all of these new people that are now coming to food banks because they can no longer afford rent or afford food. There's a huge amount of them that are beginning to fall out of the bottom of disability supports in provinces, of Ontario Works that we have here or whatever. They can know, like, Ontario Works person still gets $711 here in Ontario per month. And that's what they got 10 years ago. So they have to somehow now get going with that and still pay for rents now that have probably doubled since that time, right? The price of food, like, how can it be done? And those people are starting to fall out the bottom, including people on disability. They have not had a raise or an increase in 10 years either. I saw that BC hasn't had any since 2007. Right? That was during the Great Recession. So I think this really speaks to what you're talking about. The new people that are coming are really partly there because of these economic challenges from inflation, perhaps a recession that's coming on or whatever it is. But still, for food banks, a huge critical mass of the people that they're helping are people that are on social assistance. And if we froze them a decade ago, how can they possibly survive in this kind of, and that's all about policy. That's not about public generosity. Public does pay taxes to help those kind of people, but governments don't seem to want to keep up with those incremental increases that are necessary to help folks. That's what's frustrating to me. And it seems to be across all governments. They just don't seem to wish to play with that right now. They're playing for time, hoping that things will get better. Yet all of the recessions that I've been involved in, I think I've been in 4 or 5 during my time, we never went back. Food banks were born in the first recession in the 80s, and it never went back to the way it was after that recession, and it never has since. So we should be learning that we're not going to go back to the way it was before COVID, and we're going to see these numbers continue to increase. And one would think a government would invest in that to make sure people don't fall into more vulnerability. I presume that's the way you see it.
Yeah, I see it exactly the same way. And even if economically, the indicators in the public or, the economic indicators show that we dip out or we don't even hit quite a recession, we know that food banks see people for an extended period of time following any sort of economic trouble. It's not that we get to dip in and out of economic trouble quickly, because people, as you said, especially those who are on social assistance, can't swing out quickly. And when you the risk, I think, is how many of the new folks who are using food banks are going to fall into social assistance, which is, it's just a mountain to climb out of. It's near impossible. And so how do we convince governments that this isn't a critical investment? I'm encouraged by the federal disability benefit that is moving its way through Parliament and will then need to be designed and delivered. But that's just one tiny piece, and there's so much more that needs to be done. And you're right. There's no government at any level that seems to be taking what I would call a courageous approach in addressing the needs of our neighbors.
So I totally agree. So can we talk about something quite difficult for us to
Yeah.
talk about as food banks? I'm not looking for your opinion on this, but I will give you mine. It's very difficult, I think, when you see the amount of generosity I think that we receive from grocery store chains and everything else. It's been pretty phenomenal here in London. Like they've done so much. And yet people are thankful for that. And then they read the news and they see about food profits that these companies and others make. And I'm not trying to single out any particular one of them, but I know as I'm out there more and more, average people are bringing that up with me. And the local store managers, I do speak with them and look at Glen, we hear you, we hear what the people are saying, but we don't set those policies. Those are done at more of a corporate level. And that's a bit like government as well, right? It seems to me that policies are established elsewhere. They kind of bleed down into communities, but they're not malleable enough for us to be able to take those things and then really put a dent into poverty or food insecurity. We face that as a London Food Bank. I'm sure that you must face that as Food Banks Canada. I'm not asking for your opinion, but I do think we look to you, and you've been so fantastic at it, to work with these large national chains to bring them on side. And many of them are very, very generous and have done a lot for food banks over the last while. Can I just ask you if you find that a little bit difficult to navigate, or do you find that it's okay? Actually, people are listening.
I mean, like you said, I find that we've as a system we've benefited from the generosity of these companies. I do think it's still, in some ways, what I'm feeling is there's a lot of anger about a lot of things, and it's popping out in different places. So one is at the profits of the grocery stores. One is at, people are upset about, controversial things like medically assisted dying, because how does that intersect? And I apologize, I've got sirens going by, but, what I think we're all really upset about is the fact that it doesn't feel like anyone's doing anything about the number of people that we're seeing. And my honest opinion is that we need to figure out a way to get more people out of poverty in this country. And that's the solution. The attention needs to be on governments and government policy. Yeah. And all of us need to play our part, but I think that would be a different conversation if we weren't seeing record-breaking numbers over and over right now.
That's a seasoned answer, I think. I think that's quite right. Everybody's kind of, you can't see your reflection in boiling water. And it just seems to me that a lot of people are really, really upset. Canadians in general across the country about what they're seeing. I think that's really true. I did want to thank you also. I've been looking at a lot of the numbers about how Food Banks Canada, by working with national companies, and it's not just all around food, it's about funding, about resources and other things. I don't know how food banks in many ways would survive if it wasn't for somebody at the national level that's getting national headquarters and others, including governments and policies and others, but a spokesperson for food banks at a national level who's able to drop into a meeting and remind a company or a government or whatever it is of all of these things. But you've actually been fairly successful as Food Banks Canada in recent years in leveraging some of those resources. And I'm not just talking food, but in leverage. Could you maybe just talk a bit about that and what you've been able to accomplish that way in the last few years?
Sure, but I think the thanks goes the other way. So Food Banks Canada can only be as strong as the food banking system. And I think we have obviously benefited from the leadership of food banks across the country. And I see us nationally as in service of the work you all do locally, which is so much harder than anything that we do at the national level. And so the gratitude honestly flows the other way. I think it's like a privilege, and it's so exciting to be able to take the energy that I get to witness. I mean, I have the best job in the world, so I get to see all the innovation and the generosity and those intersections of magic that happen at a local food bank where volunteers come and donors come and clients come, and there's something, and like you said, the greenhouses, all the innovation that's happening across the country, and share that story with with companies and with governments. So in the last few years, I would say we've had people really, I think because of COVID, because of some of these tough times, really open to having that conversation, really wanting to understand how they can help and what can we do to support. And I think we're hitting a moment where, companies, when we go through tough economic times, companies also look at their balance sheets. And so I would say at a corporate level, we're having some conversations where either companies are looking to say, where can we make cuts? So that's the reality we're feeling at the national level. That said, we've got some very long-standing supportive partners who we feel are with us on this journey. But it's the same thing with governments. A lot of empathy, a lot of I care about this issue, and yet we're not seeing the policy action. So it's not that we're not being heard. It almost feels, especially at the government level, we don't know what lever to pull right at this moment, and so we don't know where to make the change. Yeah. But I don't feel ever that I'm talking to people who don't care.
Yeah.
Which is one step in the right direction. It doesn't get us across the finish line, but.
Well, I just tried to thank you and Food Banks Canada for what you've done. You flipped that around very nicely to thank Food Banks for what they've done. But what people forget is I was there at the founding meeting of Food Banks Canada, right? I was there. And the reason why it was founded, and there weren't all that many food banks back then when we first did it. I mean, it's a long time ago. But the reason why we did it was for the lack of a national presence, right? There were provincial things kind of going on, but so much around policy and other things, and even businesses, national headquarters in some places, not others. And there was a real need amongst food banks to be able to say, we need to have a scope or a reach that gets to that level. And you have done that. And you've done that repeatedly. And I don't just mean you, I mean the good folks at Food Banks Canada. But I feel much better at going out there every day and trying to do what I can, as all good food bankers try to do, knowing that we're not here in our own little corner of the world trying to just nudge things forward a little bit, that we have senior partners in Ottawa and in provincial capitals and others that are doing these kind of things. Because for us, it feels kind of hopeless without that. If there's not a light being shone in those big decision-making, policy-making areas, then we're in trouble. And I do thank you. And I think all of us as food banks do that, not because you just represent resources that come our way, that you try to channel certain policies, guidelines, codes of ethics, all of those things that you send our way, which are a real help. You actually provide us a sense of witness, a sense of being able to believe that in our actions that we do every day, that might be picked up a little bit by local media or local people, these things resonate far away in provincial capitals, even in national, in Ottawa. And I do want to thank you for that, because some are big picture thinkers. It's the way that they are. And to know that we have that witness and that kind of reach, that means a lot to us. I know we mean a lot to you as well, and you understand that stuff. It's a great partnership. And we're running out of time here, but I just want to thank you for when COVID came. COVID was not a Southwestern Ontario emergency. Now, when you look at what we're going on, what's happening now, this is not a local food insecurity emergency. It's a national one. Yep. We really need people with your kind of abilities to do that. So thank your organization for us. It's really important. It's important for people of London too, to know that kind of witness is happening elsewhere. Thanks for doing this, Kirstin, and we'll respond to you again in another few months. We'll see where we're at.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kirstin.
Take care.